So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining part 3 of our 2021 scholarship application webinar series. I'd like to begin our session today by first acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the lands on which I'm joining today's session from. But in addition to this, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia, wherever you might be joining this session from, and pay our respects to their elders, culture and heritage. So just a few quick notes before we delve into the session today. A few Zoom etiquette things that will just help us run smoothly. If you can all just keep your microphones muted for the duration of the session. And as you know, today's session is mostly a Q&A with one of our scholars who's joined us, but how that will work is I'll actually facilitate the Q&A, but if you could just submit your questions in the chat in a little while when we start our conversation with Bridget, that'd be wonderful, and just remain muted just so it's easier to manage the conversation. So what we're covering today, as mentioned, obviously there's the Q&A portion, but before we get to that, I'll just run over really quickly a couple of important reminders with our online application. And then of course, we'll jump into that conversation with our 2018 John Monash Scholar, Bridget Salmon, and we'll talk a little bit more about Bridget and her academic background and sort of professional background when we get to that part of the discussion. But just quickly jumping onto the updates on the online application, which I'm sure you're all getting along with at the moment, where we've got under a month to go, which is very exciting. I've received quite a few questions over the past weeks regarding the referees and just a few questions around when those reports are due, and just to sort of iterate again that the referee reports must be submitted with your application by the application deadline, which of course is 11:59 p.m. on the 14th of July. Sorry, that's just missed off the slide there, but on the 14th of July at 11:59 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard. And noting that when the referees receive the information to complete on your behalf is completely up to you. You drive that out of your own application through the request portal on your application dashboard. So the sooner you get those out, the more time you give your referees to complete the information. I sent out an email a couple of weeks ago just with some further details on what the referees are asked and how you can brief them. I'm happy to send that information out again if it's helpful, or if you've missed it. But certainly do keep in mind that they have to have completed their reports by the application deadline, 11:59 p.m. On the 14th of July. And lastly, a few more questions have been popping up regarding the interview process, which of course happens after the shortlisting of the online applications, which will happen of course once we've closed applications. All of the dates are actually available for the first round of interviews on the website, and they're there so you can obviously keep them in mind for planning purposes should you be shortlisted for an interview. And essentially at this stage, we're still, whilst we've confirmed all the dates and all of our panel members, we're basically going ahead planning for the case that we'll be able to host them in person as we usually do, and confirming those details around the country with all of our various host institutions. But we're also at the same time making plans to conduct them virtually should that be, I guess, the requirement closer to the date. But at any rate, you can find all of those dates on the website should you be interested, obviously keeping in mind that your location around Australia or overseas is how you are allocated to an interview if you are shortlisted to the interview stage. So on to the much more exciting portion of the session today. our Q&A with our 2018 scholar, Bridget Salmon. What I'll do for this part is I'll stop sharing my screen shortly so that you can see myself and Bridget for the Q&A portion. I've got a few questions that I'll use to kick off the discussion with Bridget, and then of course, as mentioned, please pop any questions you might have in the chat, and then I'll ask those as well during the session. So hi Bridget.
Hello.
I can see you there. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'll just get my view on.
Pleasure.
So I guess just to give everyone a bit of background about yourself, and obviously I mentioned that you're a 2018 John Monash Scholar, but perhaps we could start off with mentioning what degree you did your study with for the John Monash Scholarship, but perhaps to lead into that, a bit of background about why you came to apply for the scholarship in the first place.
Sure. So I did my degree in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, at Erasmus University, and I did a Masters of Urban Management and Development. Prior to that, I was working in private consulting. I'm an urban planner, I should mention, and I was working for a private consulting firm and had also worked for local government for about 5 years. And I guess I've decided to apply for the scholarship, one, because I'd heard about John Monash through a friend who had also received a scholarship, and I sort of had never thought about the fact that this opportunity was available. But in my work, I kept on coming up against this same issue, and I was having a really difficult time finding older members of the planning community that could help me address the issue. And I guess for me, that's really about getting sound economic principles into planning discussions around the issue of housing affordability. And so I guess the reason I wanted to apply was sort of threefold. So one was to improve my own knowledge, but also to improve the knowledge and try and have an impact on the industry at a broader scale. And then three, it was because I feel like there's a huge leadership gap in the industry, and I feel like I had the potential to play a role there, and that the scholarship would enable me to do that.
Wonderful. And you then, after receiving the scholarship, obviously went over to the Netherlands. Before we get on to that part, maybe if you could give us a little bit of an idea about what you recall of the application and selection process, and I guess any particulars you remember about applying, how you prepared, and I guess the experience overall with the interviews and that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. So I've written a few notes. Sorry, so I'm just looking down at my piece of paper here. I remember feeling very nervous about the entire process, obviously, but I remember that somebody said to me, that's only ever a good thing because it means that you're genuinely interested in what it is that you're pursuing. So to use that sort of energy that you get from the nervousness associated with the process. I think the best advice that I received at the time was to get yourself a trusted person that you can sort of exchange ideas with, particularly the written component of the application. And for me, that was my sister. And I guess the reason that worked so well is because of the relationship that we have. She can say things to me that perhaps other people wouldn't feel comfortable saying. And we went through this process that was really helpful for me, where she would ask me a question similar to what Alex is doing right now, and I would answer, and she would jot down some notes, because at the start I was so nervous about the thought of applying that I found it really hard to put pen to paper, and that process was just so helpful. And she really helped me sort of, I guess, concrete my pitch, but also make me feel more confident in myself that this was something that was actually worthwhile. Another piece of advice I also received at the time was to have 5 key things that it is that you want from this process, and keep on repeating them to yourself, because it'll again firm up your pitch, but it also during the interview process means that you don't get sidelined. You can go back to those 5 key things that you have inside your brain and the message that you want to deliver to the interview panelists. Definitely, if you are lucky enough to get through to the state interviews, research that the foundation will give you a list of the people on the panel. I'd really recommend researching all of those interview panel members, and think about what their view on your proposal might be, and that way you sort of can start to think a little bit about the type of questions that they might be interested in, and sort of making sure that you can have more of a conversation in the interview rather than it just sort of being this very more traditional back and forth discussion. The interviews, obviously they're scary, but the panelists do everything they can to make you feel as comfortable as possible. And that was really surprising to me, and that very, very helpful. But so obviously be prepared, but that it is a safe environment that you're going into. And so I think that's important to remember. Preparing for the interviews, again, I sort of ran through that same process with my sister, and we would talk about the types of questions, and she would really poke holes in some of my statements, and again, having that trusted person that perhaps when you're feeling quite nervous about something, that you know the only reason they're doing that is because they support you and want you to get through this process, was really, really valuable. Yeah.
Amazing. All very solid advice. So having then navigated your way through the selection process, you then got to go and study overseas. So maybe if you could tell all of the candidates today a bit about that experience of studying abroad, and perhaps specifically why you ended up landing on the decision that you made, and yeah, just a bit about how it all went.
Yeah. Well, it was amazing. The entire experience was actually incredible. If you do have a chance to visit or study in the Netherlands, I cannot recommend it enough. I guess it felt like such a luxury to be able at 28 to take an early career break and just study and think and sort of immerse yourself in knowledge for 12 months. It's just such a privilege, and I think I sort of had to keep on reminding myself of that through the entire process. And I think because of how lucky I felt to be able to have that experience, it meant that with my actual studies, I was able to sort of go in there 100%. A few of the other students in my cohort were perhaps doing it just because they wanted to get a master's, I guess. And because of the process that I'd gone through John Monash and this very specific aim that I had in mind that I wanted to get through my master's, I think I was able to take so much more from the actual learning process of it. I lived on campus, which was an experience in itself. The Netherlands, despite doing housing very well, they don't do student housing that well. But again, I'd really recommend that, particularly if you're only going for a 1-year master's program, because it sort of cements that university experience that you're really there for. I left my partner for a year, and that was challenging as well. But I would never. We proved that you can do it, and it's fine. It's hard, but it's fine. And I would always say to people to not let that aspect of the process hold you back. The European. So I had originally pitched to go to University College London to do my master's, and I'd spoken to a lot of people about University College, and had Erasmus as my second choice. But the closer it got to, and I was fortunate enough to get into a number of those sort of English institutions, the closer it got, I did some more thinking, and once I was sort of in the scholarship community, a lot of people spoke to me about, I guess, the different types of knowledge and teaching approaches in European universities in comparison to the UK. And then I spoke to a few more academics in Melbourne, and I decided that particularly if you think about housing and urban planning, the Netherlands was really the right place for me. And the foundation was really supportive of me, I guess, referring to what was my second option at the time. And I think a really important message is that don't go for the most elite institution just because you think it sounds good. Go for the institution that you think will support what you would like to achieve. And there are so many incredible universities all across the world, particularly in Asia and Europe, that perhaps there have been less scholars attend, but everyone you meet who has attended those institutions, I feel like has got perhaps a little bit more of a unique experience from them. Yeah, so do pick your university based on your issue, the gap that you've identified, not based on prestige.
Yeah, that's very important advice and a good point to touch upon. And I think another nice point that you mentioned there sort of leads into another question I was thinking about, which you mentioned that you got some good support from the sort of scholar community in sort of refining your choice at the end between Erasmus and also UCL, for example. Delving a bit more into the alumni community, or the scholar community as we like to call it, because it's sort of once a scholar, always a scholar, never escape sort of family environment. What did that sort of, what was it like being overseas, having that network? And I guess further to that, what's it meant, I guess, being a part of that network coming home?
I think particularly while I was studying, I was a little bit nervous because I was the only scholar that had been to the Netherlands, so I didn't have that immediate sort of physical connection or alumni within the country that I was in. But obviously there's a Eurostar right away to London, and I did go over there a few times. I actually ended up doing my dissertation on a case study in London anyway, so I was there a fair bit. And I guess it's sort of this notion of knowing that there's someone there that's going through the exact same experience as you, that you can ask questions to. It's hard to articulate how supportive the actual community is, but you feel as though you have this little safety net that can catch you if you're having a bad day, basically. And there are various sort of social media platforms that we all chat on, and I guess it's that knowing that someone's experiencing the same thing as you and that they're there to talk to. Also super fun things, like we had a really lovely London dinner that I was able to attend, and it was at Australia House where they filmed Harry Potter, or part of Harry Potter, and it was excellent, being able to, I guess, from a networking perspective, meet people that are in very senior positions in London and talk with them about your research. And one of the fantastic things that happens when you're a scholar is that people, when you go to an event like that, you have something to talk about because you're going through this experience, but people are really interested in your ideas, potentially people that otherwise you wouldn't get an opportunity to speak with. And that component of the networking was really wonderful while I was in the Netherlands. And also particularly if you got a little bit homesick, London's full of Australians. And so being a 3-hour train ride away was also helpful. I think in terms of coming home, I think it's one of those things where you get as much out of it that you put in. So there's, again, it's quite hard to articulate, but as Alex said, as soon as you're there, as soon as you're within the community that exists, it's not like you just study and then you go back to your life, as it were. There's always opportunities being presented to either attend an event where perhaps they need a scholar to represent, but also go back and meet new scholars coming through as well, and or do exactly what I'm doing now. And again, that sort of transition back to Australia is challenging, and having a sounding board of, this is what I'm feeling nervous about. Does anyone know anyone that works in this industry? All of that sort of aspect of it has been incredible.
Wonderful. And I guess another thing with coming back to Australia, I think that we do benefit from having, I guess, more and more coming back here. And I think we got to see an aspect of that with our most recent global symposia in Melbourne, which we were delighted to have you be a part of and be on one of the panels in particular. Would you have anything particular to share about that experience? Because I know that the idea of how you can sort of leverage this network for collective impact is something that, as a foundation and as a community, we're all really mindful of, and might be useful context for the applicants as well.
Yeah, I think one of the, and I probably should have mentioned it in response to my last question, but the ability to meet people from totally different industries that you just would have never had exposure to, and have a quite in-depth, long conversation or a debate or a discussion. It's quite hard to do that in sort of normal life circumstances, but the foundation, because there is such a diversity of people interested in working in different fields, you do get that opportunity, and it's incredible how quickly you can make a connection about something that you're interested in from a professional sense. That, say, if you're talking to a biomedical engineer or a human rights lawyer, or you immediately can find common ground, but not just sort of in a social sense, but in a professional sense as well. Like, I remember when I first got the scholarship and we went up to Sydney and had a sort of a few days together. And by the end of that weekend, Kevin, another scholar in my cohort, and I had sort of come up with this plan of how to solve the public health crisis. And had we, not the pandemic, had we sort of looked at each other's resumes before going, I wouldn't have thought that Kevin would be this person that I could sort of immediately connect with and think about planning a future idea. So yeah, that aspect of it is fantastic. And the symposium is also an excellent way to ensure that through this sort of process of learning, that it is lifelong as well. So regardless of how many years you may be back in Australia, or perhaps you've stayed in your chosen country for a little while, there's an opportunity once a year to come back and remind yourself a little bit of what it is that you're fighting for, which I think is excellent.
Yeah, it's nice as well that you mentioned the sort of scholar, like the new cohort gathering that we have as well, because I think it's always a very exciting and special time for the foundation when we sort of get to fully meet our new cohort. But it is amazing to see when you all gather together just how quickly those sorts of ideas spiral off just like conversations around the dinner table, which essentially is, what those sort of informal gatherings are all about. Followed by those more formal gatherings, such as at the Opera House later that night with all of our sort of supporters and patrons and that kind of thing, which is exciting. It brings to life the work that you all do. I have one more question, but I think it might work better as a bit of a closing question. So I might jump into some of the questions we're receiving from the applicants, if that's all right. Yeah. So we've got one here which is around how you frame in the application, I suppose, and I presume also relevant for the interview. But how specific do you think your vision for the impact of Australian society needs to be, or how much of an emphasis did you place on this in your application, I guess, and I'm happy to sort of answer it as well from my perspective, but perhaps from your own experience, how did you go with framing that in your written application?
Yeah, so I think be as specific as you can be. So don't just sort of say something will have an impact. Obviously explain what you believe that impact will be, but also why it refer it back to what it is that you need to be doing in order to create that impact, if that makes sense. So circle right round. I think, using myself as an example, in my application, I focused a lot on equitable access to housing, but housing affordability is a huge issue, and I took specific issue with a certain component of that, which is sort of this area of urban economics that I'm interested in. So it is very specific, but then I could relate it back to how it's important for Australia in broader context. So it's very important to not be kind of single industry focused, if that makes sense. So when you're thinking about and articulating the impact that you will have, you have to be able to relate it beyond your own specific industry. So again, with housing affordability or equitable access to housing, it's not like if you achieve that, then it's going to have a broad reaching impact across every other industry and sector that exists, and sort of work towards achieving other aspects that are also being pursued by other people in different industries as well. So I think, yes, be as specific as possible, but I wouldn't also worry about sort of quantifying the specifics. So, I wasn't there saying, at the moment, a medium level income can, get access to 20% of housing within Melbourne's inner urban area. I wasn't saying that my work specifically was going to increase that percentage, by X, Y, and Z. So I don't think you need to numerically, at least in my opinion, I don't think you need to numerically articulate the impact that you think you'll have.
Yeah, I think you've summed that up perfectly. It's important to be, in terms of the vision, it's an essential aspect of the application and selection criteria. So that does need to be very specific. And I think if it's lacking, it's very unlikely that you get to the selection panel. It's probably the most blunt way to put it. And the panel will then really want to delve into the sort of trajectory, in a sense. So there is an importance there in being clear on what it is. But of course, specificity will vary greatly depending on what the impact is, and of course the discipline, and so the clarity is important, but it looks different for everyone, I think, is also important. But you're right, I don't think that you need to quantify it, I guess, numerically at the application stage, particularly because there's probably not scope for it, but you need to make sure that it comes through very clearly to the assessors what it is you want to achieve and why it's important.
Sorry, just to add one final thing as well. I think one of the reasons why my application was received quite positively was because I also talked about the multiple layers in which you can have an impact. So it's not just through this form of study. It added to the work that I was already doing from an advocacy perspective, and then needed this study in order to progress in the profession, and sort of added those layers of advocacy, the professional work, and then I was already a little bit involved in academia as well. So there's this sort of layering of impact, which I think was helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point as well, because what we are looking to sort of get out of an applicant is that they are going to be innovative and collaborative and willing to work across, disciplinary boundaries to work towards problems that require that sort of approach. And that's a very great point for applicants to keep in mind, sort of layering their approach to this impact. Another question which sort of does relate quite a bit to that particular section as well. So have you found that your career has followed the path you proposed in your application? Which is one that I love, because we do often reflect on this with alumni down the track. And then also, as an addition to that, if you have had the conversation with other scholars, how about their careers and how they reflect back on that pathway?
It's hard because the application, requires you to be very specific about this career direction that you would like to have. I actually reread my application the other day because someone was asking me for some help, and it is quite interesting. I mean, in terms of the trajectory that I placed myself on, I am where I wanted to be. So I guess a part of my ethos is that planning is a public service. And so I did write about the fact that when I returned to Australia, I wanted to either work in the not-for-profit or public space, and I am now working for the government, so tick. But I also, in that sort of 30-year projection, I think it was, I spoke about wanting to work, be the CEO of a local government organisation because of the tangible impacts to the community at that level of government. And it's definitely still something that I'm interested in, but now working for government at the state level, I'm getting exposed to other things where I'm also seeing where I could be perhaps a bit more impactful. So yeah, like I have done, I guess, what I had planned to do, bearing in mind that it's not even a year since I've been back. And talking to other people, I'm just trying to think of others' experiences. I feel like, and I also think about this a lot too, for a few people that did masters, they've gone back now to do further PhD work, which I think is quite common, but not something perhaps that they had thought about doing. And I think that's just associated with that sort of challenge that we all face about wanting to have more agency and control over the direction of your work, which a PhD can provide you. And yeah, I'm not actually, I can't think of any stories of someone who hasn't who's had a complete career change, or who's not worked towards what it was that they had sort of originally intended to do.
Yeah, I think my experience is pretty consistent with that. When I think of people who have in similar circumstances, perhaps we've gotten some alumni to sit on a panel with either university presentations, or thinking of our most recent, like the 2020 cohort of scholars came together for their orientation and leadership development sessions at the start of this year. And as a part of that, we had an alumni panel, and one of the questions was about sort of their leadership journey, which of course is a bit buzzwordy, but they all reflected on their written application, which for some of them, was 10 years ago or more. And what they all enjoyed about the process, and I mean, this is what I find to be quite consistent with most scholars that I've spoken to in similar circumstances, is that what is always nice for them is that the end goal that they had laid out is still true for them. But in many cases, the pathway itself may have changed vastly at some stage, but they're still working towards their sort of ultimate impact. And I think that's something that we do try and encourage applicants to consider in putting together the application, is that the trajectory is a hard aspect of the written application, and it needs to be, because we're looking to really ascertain how considered this plan is for you and how dedicated you are to the end goal. So much so that you have considered, given your current life circumstances, what pathway it could take. But of course, once you're on that pathway, opportunities pop up, doors open, things might change and shift, and how you end up working towards it might become different to how you envisaged it at this very moment in time. But as a part of the process of ascertaining you're the person who will keep working towards that goal, we require this trajectory of your thinking at this stage. So it's not a binding contract is always our go-to statement, but it certainly gives a great opportunity to evidence the sort of commitment to the end goal.
And I think don't be afraid to be really specific with what that goal is. Like, I went through sort of periodically and sort of spoke about why it is that I'd worked not-for-profit or public sector at the state level, and then sort of spoke about it, then after a few years, I think I was very, very specific in the way that I saw that pathway being laid out to get to that end goal. And that can be a bit scary as well, but also a super helpful process, regardless of how you go with the application itself. Having that chance to actually sit and reflect and be really conscious of this pathway and career that you're heading towards or already on is a really worthwhile exercise, regardless of how well you do in the scholarship process.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we would like to encourage applicants to consider as well, that regardless of whether or not you get a scholarship out of this, at the very least, it's a very solid exercise in self-reflection and plenty of opportunities for feedback along the way at all stages of the application process. So yeah, it's more than the scholarship itself, although of course that's probably what, you know, it's a pretty enticing end goal as well.
Fun thing
oh
to
yeah,
that.
of course, John.
Yeah, I think it's really important to ask yourself, if I didn't get this scholarship, what would I do? And I think if you can't answer that question, you know, that might be reflective of the fact that your plan isn't concrete enough. And I think you need to be prepared and, you know, have your trusted person speak through that process with you, because if the only intention is just to study and you don't have that plan, I think it becomes very apparent very quickly.
Yeah, really great advice. On to another question here. And I think you have touched on this a little bit in terms of your conversations with your sister, but were there any specific resources that you used to help when writing the application, or anything in particular that you sort of utilised to try and make yourself stand out?
Gabrielle, my sister, was sort of definitely that resource, I guess, if you will. I think probably I spoke to 3 or 4 ex-scholars as well. That the foundation also puts you in contact with some people. So that was really helpful, particularly for interviews, to speak with someone who's gone through that process before. I spoke to academics about my plan and particularly thinking about the universities that I wanted to attend. But in terms of resources beyond other people, no. I mean, obviously I have a very serious interest in this, so I felt like I had the intellect and understanding of the issue that I didn't need to sort of go off and do a whole lot of other, you know, sort of literature review-esque research. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think that drawing on lots of people as resources is a great way to go about it. And as mentioned, we do a lot of facilitating introductions with scholars chat to, particularly at that interview stage, but also before that, if people reach out directly, and they are a great resource because of their perspective of the process, of course. And I would probably also say, in terms of making yourself stand out, sometimes it sounds like a bit silly, but it's not. Like, you really just make sure you're being genuine in what you're putting in the application, because that really comes through in how you read it, in how it's read. I think that it's solid advice to sort of reflect back on. And also, as Bridge was saying before, ask yourself what you would do if you didn't get this scholarship. I think that's an amazing reflection to help make sure that you're really seeking the right level of clarity in the entire application.
And I think too, if you're lucky enough to get through the interviews, like, always overdress for what you think is because as unfortunate as it is, obviously people make impressions from the way that you present yourself. So if you've got a suit, wear a suit. If you don't have a suit, wear something as close to it as possible. Because also it'll make, when you're preparing for the interview, it'll make you feel so much better. And when I was standing waiting for my state interview, I must have looked like I was about to faint. And the lovely lady who was in Alex's role then, who I can't remember her name, which is terrible, but she told me to press into my thumb and like this in my palm, and that makes the stress go away. And I don't know if that's a lie, but it definitely worked. So that's also a hot tip for interview prep as well.
I'll have to remember that one. Yeah, no, it's true though. I think that you've got to do things that will help build up your confidence for interviews, because by nature, they're about that 25 minutes that you've got in the room at that moment. So you've got to do what you can to make sure you go in feeling well prepared, that's for sure. There's another question here about, can I ask what the process is like from being potentially successful with the scholarship to then going on and applying for a place at the university that you've chosen. So I'm guessing that the question here is around, yeah, how is it when you're actually applying for overseas study at these universities? Like, is it really laborious? Did it help having the scholarship? Those sorts of things.
So one, absolutely it helps having the scholarship, because it's sort of, I think for the universities, and I spoke to my university a lot about this, is that they feel more confident in their ability, because somebody else has kind of already fact-checked you a little bit. And any Joe Blow can Google John Monash Foundation and discover that it is a very serious institution that provides the criteria associated with the scholarship. So I think one, absolutely having the scholarship helps. Also because it shows that you have financial capacity. Two, I was very lucky that I didn't want to, actually I did end up applying for American university, just one, but I'd never really been that interested in studying in the States. But I know that if you are interested in that, and obviously there are fantastic universities over there, that the GRE can be quite a stressful process. So I guess that's about giving yourself as much time to prepare for that as possible. And I think also because the Dutch, being Dutch, they're a little bit more like Australians in that they're not looking for this sort of more outward, they're a bit more humble than, say, perhaps the Americans. And so I think my friends that have applied for American institutions found the whole selling yourself thing quite challenging, and a bit sort of that issue of genuineness, like perhaps that sort of American more cultural stuff, is that we're not super comfortable with that, but you just have to do it, otherwise the American institutions may think you're too humble. But yeah, it takes time. It takes many hours, and you're constantly having to ask different people for referees, for references. I think a really good tip with that is, at the time that I applied, we needed 2 references, and after I had got the scholarship, I asked for one university reference and asked them if I could change the bits that related to the university section. And then I just, before I sent off the application, I just quickly send them and say, are you happy for me to send this off? And so it reduced their involvement a lot, because it's hard writing references as well for people. But yeah, give yourself as much time for that. You can reuse some of your scholarship application work, which is really helpful and does reduce effort a little bit. But yeah, many hours, but it's worth it. And apply for as many as you want as well.
Yeah, that's very true. It's with the references and that sort of thing, I mean, the foundation does references often for scholars as they're applying for these institutions, and that's become one of my favorite things, is just update, like getting the bulk of it done for one institution, and then it's the quick changing process of just the name of the institution and the degree going forward. But it's good advice to consider, particularly context of where you're applying and what that might mean for tone, and context of how you frame your application. I know that John Monash Scholars become very well versed in their elevator pitch, but it always feels uncomfortable to begin with, I'm sure, but we make you do it anyway at length.
And it's worth it. Yeah.
Good. Glad to hear it. There's another question here about how specific does the career plan need to be, and I think we got into that in a fair bit of detail already, so I will leave that one. But there is a couple more that we'll just try and get through before wrapping up. So how has your perspective been shaped on the value of traditional postgrad university degrees versus online degrees or on-the-job training? So I'm guessing this is, in light of having completed the master's.
Sorry, could you just ask the question again?
Yeah, so the question is, how has your perspective been shaped on the value of traditional postgraduate university degrees versus online degrees or on-the-job training?
Okay. Well, I can't really comment on the online component because I didn't study online. But I think in terms of the study shaping my values as a professional, there's sort of a little, I guess there's multiple components to it. One is that, and this was quite unique to the course that I chose, and I didn't actually realise this about it until I got there, but we had 90 students across the masters from 44 different countries and no more than 9 students from any one country, and I was the only Australian. And that aspect of it, more so, well, that aspect of it made me so much more aware of planning issues across the world, obviously, because you're working with students from 44 different countries, but also from a learning and growth perspective. Being the only Australian in my course, it meant that you didn't have anyone to fall back on with your sort of cultural nuances and norms. And so you have to put yourself out there, and you have to meet and learn from and have discussions with all different types of people with all different types of experiences. And that to me was just absolutely invaluable. And it's, I think, made me a much better person, but also in the way in which I conduct myself professionally in the workplace. I think I'm much more genuine in terms of being understanding and empathetic, and wanting to actually listen to other people, like really listen to other people's opinions. And I think perhaps before my study, where I was in between this period of finishing my undergraduate degree and going off to my master's, I think perhaps I maybe thought of myself a little bit too highly, and was less willing to listen to other people's opinions. And actually the master's, even though it increased my education levels and in certain aspects, I think it also made me a much better listener, and much more in tune with different countries' approaches to different things. Yeah, so it definitely has shaped, if that was sort of what the question was leaning towards. And definitely there's no doubt that it's made me a better professional and I hope a better person. But another really key thing that I feel like I took away from the process was how Australia is quite small and, you know, we sort of like to think of ourselves as Europeans, but really we're sort of a bigger part of Asia. And I had these sort of preconceived notions of people doing better things in places in the global north, but actually a lot of the examples that I now refer to in my own work are from countries that I had never thought of researching planning policies or land use regulation before. And I would like to continue to do that, because you can always see someone a little bit surprised when you're sort of referencing a tool used in Colombia, or thinking about the way Philippines do their climate resilience work. And, you know, I think that was completely invaluable to be able to learn from, like, have a truly global experience. I did teach this semester online, and I felt a little bit sorry for the students. Like, I feel like a part of the experience of going overseas and doing your master's is sort of physically, obviously, being in a different location, and getting to meet, you know, that experience that I just explained. I don't think I would have been able to have that had it been an online environment. And I understand, you know, the world has changed quite significantly since last year, but my preference would always be to study in person. Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think that you've given some really interesting sort of some add-ons there in terms of advice that you can get out of these experiences. And I mean, from a foundation perspective, it just sort of makes us, you know, glow with happiness to know that it is this multi-layered experience that we want it to be for our scholars. Couple more questions that we'll try and zip through, as we're getting pretty close to 5 o'clock. So I'll ask if at this stage, if anyone has any more questions. I won't be able to get through them, but I'll either answer them myself by email, or I can try and direct them to Bridget by email, if you're all right with that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So it's a quick question about how you, in the application and probably the interview as well, but how you discussed your professional and voluntary leadership. I guess the distinction between the two, or just how you highlighted the relevance of your experience to your overall goals.
Yeah, so I focused on specific examples. So rather than sort of trying to speak quite broadly, I spoke about, well, like from a professional experience perspective, what I did, but then using specific examples where leadership had been demonstrated. And that, again, this sort of circling back a little bit made sure that, you know, you answered that in that the STAR format, so, you know, the situation, which I can't remember the acronyms, you'll know them, Alex, situation, task, anyway, but the making sure you cover off all the components of the example that you're describing. And for voluntary, I had a lot of, well, I volunteer a lot with the Planning Institute of Australia, and so I guess I had a lot of concrete examples because I had been on the Women's Planning Network as the convener associated with that, and I was able to talk about what that experience gave me, but also relate it back to the issue at hand, if that makes sense. So yeah, so I definitely think there is a distinction, but the example, I would say, use examples and link it back to the problem or the issue that you're addressing.
Yeah, that's really solid advice. I think the other thing with the panel is, and the online application as well, is evidencing. Yeah, I think the STAR thing is a good way to go about it, and I think it's definitely situation. I want to say task, action, response, or results. Yeah. I think it is.
Yeah.
And it's a good tool because you do want to evidence, I guess, your learning from these situations you've been in, and take that forward into the discussions at the panel level as well. I think we've got 2 more questions that I'll make sure that's it, promise. So how did, and I can sort of add to this question as well, because it's sort of front of mind for me too, but how different was the state interview for you compared to the national interview? And did you notice differences in the tone or the questions?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are differences. I think in the state interview, it was very much about, I mean, you have such limited time with people. It was very much about the questions were geared as to why this study and why it can relate back to this issue that you're, or the gap that you've identified. And I guess sort of the state interview questions were quite, I feel like broader, it's not a good way to describe it, but in contrast to the national interview, that impact that you were talking about was scrutinised a fair bit more. So like there was I had some people on my panel that had been quite heavily involved in the built environment work, and so they could sort of provide an example and say, well, how will this impact, you know, how will your impact address this? Or, you know, you're focused on a really specific issue here, but what about in this context? How would it be addressed here? And I'm also, sorry, I'm just trying to think through the national questions. I feel like they asked me in the national interview also more about my career pathway and the challenges of like the challenges of working in government and how I would actually work through those. And that was a really specific and a really hard question to answer. I just feel like the vibe in the national interview, obviously it was still comfortable, but it felt much more serious. And the state one still feels serious, but I don't know, maybe it's just because there's so much at stake. But it felt like the questions were really, really targeted and really trying to draw information out of you, more so than in the state interview. I did get feedback from in between the state and national interviews as well, which was really, really helpful from Alex's equivalent. And one of the things that they had said to me was that they weren't sure if I believed in myself. So they believed in what I had put forward was a good and genuine idea, but they weren't sure whether I was sort of the right person and confident enough to deliver it. And receiving that feedback really kicked me into gear, because I was like, no, I can definitely do this. I am the right person to do this. And I think that gave me a lot of energy and confidence going into the national interview, being like, I'm going to show every one of you that I'm the right person to do this.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and I'm always interested to hear how the feedback sort of influences how a candidate approaches that first interview to the last one, because I see it a lot being in that position now. But in terms of tone, from my perspective, just sort of quickly noting, definitely very on par with what you've said there, Bridget, that the first interview, they're really drawing out and making sure that what you put on paper is genuine. And so in essence, just making sure you wrote it and you're the person that you've put yourself down to be on paper. So in that sense, perhaps that's what gives the questions less of that really like nitty-gritty targeted feel, whilst still being very serious, and they can delve into any aspect of the application in more detail. But then certainly at that national level, they are really just trying to find out then who you are and why you're going to achieve this. So there's a lot that's similar in the questions, but definitely the delivery becomes a little bit different between the two. And throughout the process, obviously, we do sort of brief candidates on sort of, broadly speaking, themes they should sort of be prepared to sort of address, and things to keep in mind when they prepare for these interviews.
Can I just add? Sorry, can I just add
one thing
as well? I forgot to mention this. I mentioned it at the beginning, but some advice that I received was, and I feel like this really helps in the interview process, is at the end of the interview, you'll be asked if you have any questions. And the advice that I received was, don't ask a question, have those 3 or 4 points and bring them home. So you have to leave them with, this is why I want to do this is what I'm going to get out of it, this is what the impact will be. And so they're left thinking about these sort of key messages of delivery that you wanted them to know. So I do actually think that really helped me in the interview, and I think that it's a really strong way to leave an interview with that, so that they're not left thinking about your question, they're left thinking about your idea and how you're going to do it.
Yeah, that is really good advice, and I certainly think we don't want to leave them with saying, I don't have any questions, because that's the last thing you're going to say before you leave the room. So, I think that's really good to have touched upon. I've got a last question before I jump into my last question, I promise. And this one's about the sort of, in the application, you talk about your sort of personal journey and sort of even in the interviews as well, like facing adversity and overcoming those sorts of things, and how that might inform, the pathway you're on and your commitment to a cause. And I suppose this question seems to be framed around how you can share that personal journey as a part of the application without the exact phrasing is without sort of scaring or the committee or sort of being overly, I don't know, I guess walking that line between what you want to share and that sort of thing. Is that an experience you had in your interview?
I think one of what you were talking about before with being genuine, I think this is really important in that aspect of the interview question. And I feel like I wish that I had better advice as to how to share a potentially challenging, like if you've had a very challenging experience that has shaped who you are, but also might mean that you've faced adversity, which shows how resilient you are, and therefore are the right sort of candidate for the scholarship application. In my response, I was really conscious of, like, I come from a pretty privileged background, so I couldn't afford to I couldn't have done this study without the scholarship, but I haven't had a really, really challenging life, and I really didn't want to, I wanted to be as genuine as possible. And so I didn't want to have to try and like think of a challenge, you know, that even though obviously I faced some challenges, I didn't, yeah. So the approach that I took was to say exactly that like particularly I grew up in a rural area. So in contrast, I had a loving, supportive household that taught us that if you have privilege, then you also have a responsibility to do great things, and you have a responsibility to learn and listen and be a leader. And that was the sort of the approach that I took, because I felt like I wouldn't feel genuine if I spoke too much about those challenges. But that's because I haven't had them. So if you have had them, don't be nervous about putting them in there, because it is a part of what shapes you, and it can demonstrate your resiliency, which is a really important attribute that they're looking for in scholars. So I wish that I had better advice, but that's only because I haven't personally been through any sort of really harrowing experiences. Sorry.
No, I think you've actually given really, really good advice on that, because one, yes, definitely be genuine in everything you put in the application, including that section. Put down something that is formative to you, whatever that is, and sort of genuine to your life, your lived experience. So, and I agree, you shouldn't feel worried about sharing. I guess what you choose to put in there is completely up to you. You don't have to share what you don't feel like sharing either. And the same goes with the committee. I think that panels in general, they also feel very privileged to be a part of this process and to be interviewing candidates, because it's a really inspiring process to be a part of, and meeting candidates who are so excited and passionate about what they want to do across all these varied disciplines and industries and areas of impact. So don't be worried about sharing things with the committee or on your application, but certainly be genuine to what you put down, and put down what you feel comfortable with sharing, I think is the best way to probably go about it. And it's a really good question. Sort of thanks for posing it. Because it's something that actually we don't discuss a great deal in webinars and that sort of thing, and it forms a pretty important part of the discussion about your character, and resilience in particular.
Sorry, I was just maybe if it's something that the person who's asked the question is thinking about a lot, maybe they can also reach out to you, and you can pop them in contact with perhaps a more suitable alumni as well to talk through, because I'm probably not the best in that circumstance, but I'm sure that there are others who would be good to talk through.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, and I'll touch base directly. I've got everyone's names, but because I think it's valuable to discuss further, particularly with a scholar who can give some further insight. So that brings us to the end of the questions in the chat. And I will ask you my final one as a bit of a wrap up for today's session. But of course, before I do ask it, I just want to sort of thank you again for joining us, because I know it's a Friday afternoon, and that you're incredibly busy, and it's so valuable for candidates to have the opportunity to have this sort of engagement with a scholar. Particularly, you've been through it sort of in not too far in the past, but also enough so that you're back in Australia, and you've sort of had the whole, it's all cyclical, and you're back here now, and you've got a lot of insight to bring about the process in general and being a part of the alumni community. So thank you for your time and your sort of generous responses. My final question for you is, what would be your essential piece of advice that you would like to leave the applicants with today as they prepare to submit their applications?
I think you need to, sorry, my boyfriend has arrived home. It's just lost my train of thought.
The beauty of working from home.
Yeah. You need to think big. Think this kind of issue of impact, but also, why is it important for Australia. And it's so hard because you feel, because Australians are taught to be so humble, we're sort of often taught not to think as big as that, and to sort of shy away from being able to say, I think I can have an impact Australia-wide because of X. But that's how you have to think. That I think is really, really important. Research John Monash, like as a person. I think that because he's just fascinating, but also those qualities that the organisation is looking for are really apparent in him and his experiences. And so I think that'll give you really good insight as well as to what the organisation is looking for. And have your key messages that you're ready to shoot out at the end of the interview if you're fortunate enough to get there.